Time hasn't been kind to the iPod. Back in the early 2000s, Apple's white brick of musical power was the fuel that essentially ignited a still ongoing space race in mobile computing and media consumption. Nowadays though, the iPod is really just old news. Let's think about it. The top-end model is basically an iPhone with less phone. The aging model is now called the Classic, and while it's a throwback to the past and is still sold, it just doesn't sell in great numbers. Everyone's always talking about the iPhone, iPad, and Mac far more than even the word iPod crosses their minds. Now maybe this is a bit of an oversimplification. Perhaps the iPod is still relevant. I'd certainly like to think so. After all, the iPad is really what kicked off the whole technological revolution in the first place. Now there's definitely a reason why the iPod is still around. It is a calling, a destiny, and there is a reason why it's still with us today. So let's go ahead and take a more in-depth look. Now realistically, the iPod lineup today isn't so much fragmented as it is shattered. In the current lineup of iPods, there's the Shuffle, the entry-level music player. Next up is the Nano, which is currently sort of a transitional idea aimed for people who are going to the gym. It has a screen and a few more features than the iPod Shuffle, but it definitely doesn't have all the features you might like in a media player. Now the Support Act Classic rolls out next, reminiscent of the earlier days of all things i, and it's the only iPod that still has a true click wheel. Then at the top of the range, in all of 6 colors, is the Touch, which is basically a squashed, spray-painted, antenna-less iPhone. Now many ask what happens to this whole iPod line, and the answer is pretty simple. The only question really that's about the iPod line now is whether there actually has to be a family portrait at all. The top-end iPod Touch is basically designed to appeal to consumers desperate for a more affordable touch-style iOS device. The majority of people who own one purchased it for the advantage of not having to pay off an on-data contract. Hence, few people actually fill out the device's coffers with the music that its product line is designed for. The iPod Touch is rather filled with apps, games, videos, and movies really meant to be delivered to the iPhone's front door. Thus, the magnet market, which flocked to the iPod when it was introduced, have more or less been left out in the cold. The iPod Classic, the venerable last-line descendant of all those who came before, has been bereft of a major update for years, and according to experts, is likely to soon be consigned to the iPod graveyard. Now, using the iPhone, arguably what we can call Apple's flagship mobile media and communications device, is fantastic. Yet the iPhone takes on too much territory, and without fail, after holding several hours, it does have some problems. Now for one thing, battery is a big issue with the iPhone that isn't quite so pertinent with the iPods. An iPod with a focus solely on music, video, and photo playback with enormous capacity and battery life that does like the Classic does feel a need greater than Apple will likely admit. Perhaps then, it's best to find as ironic that Apple, a company dedicated to innovation, created a dated product that simply can't be brought out of the past. Now maybe the world doesn't need a new iPod, maybe we just need to stick with this current iPod line, or maybe we just need an Apple to introduce an entirely new product category like the iWatch for media consumption. Ideally, the iPod line should be about listening to music and should have great battery life and a lot of capacity in the iPod itself rather than cloud storage. It doesn't need to be like the iPod Touch, which is essentially a stripped down version of the iPhone. To be honest, the iPod Touch is sort of like the iPhone Nano. It's sort of what the iPhone is without the data contract. It's not really an iPod, and people don't really use it to be an iPod. We do still need the iPod, but not an Apple's iPod Touch sense of the word. What we really need is an iPod with the design of the iPod Nano, the storage capacity and the battery life of the iPod Classic, and the simplicity of the iPod Shuffle. Then, and truly then, Apple would actually have a market for the iPod once again. If that product description doesn't have Apple written all over it, I'm gonna be really surprised. Now, Apple may never release such an iPod. They're probably just gonna keep on pushing into this whole cloud era of computing, but I do think that this is a bit of a missed opportunity. The iPod line still has potential, and for Apple to just leave it sitting out in the cold is just a little bit sad. Many analysts are saying that Apple just needs to discontinue the iPod line and focus truly on the iPhone and iPad, but as I keep saying, the iPod can be and is still relevant today if Apple can just take it in the right direction. It just needs to be different from everyone else while still offering features that are different from what you get in a smartphone. Let me know what you want to see Apple do to the iPod though in the comments below. Please be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and I will see you next time. Bye!